Hey everybody, welcome to video number 3 for chapters 14 and 15, and in this one we're going to be talking about the Atlantic slave trade. So the African slave trade is directly tied into the conquest of the Americas by Europeans. By the 15 and 1600, Europeans began to view slaves as the most important item of African trade. And so you would see posters like the one here on the title slide. Now this is from 1769, and this is just an advertisement poster. The same that you would see for cars, the same way you would see for selling really anything. The difference is that they're talking about human beings. They're talking about buying and selling men, women, and children. So this slave trade is going to have a massively monumental changes to several continents. Now, first, a little background on the African slave trade. It's important for the context to understand that slavery had existed in Africa since ancient times. Slavery existed all over the world since ancient times. Most of the civilizations we learn about this year had slavery. Ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, Greece, Rome especially, they all had slavery. And in all these civilizations, including Africa, the most common way to become a slave was by being captured in war. One group takes over surrounding land, the conquered people are sold into slavery. Other common ways to become a slave was by committing a crime or very often paying off a debt. Now, in all of these cases, slavery was not based on race. The slavery that developed in the Americas was different in that respect. In ancient Greece or Rome, you couldn't really tell the difference between slaves and free peasants. Slavery in the Americas was 100% based on race, though, and that would have long-lasting impact on race relations in many countries to this day. So now that we've established that slavery already existed in Africa before Europeans got there, it logically flows that the first African slaves brought to the Americas were bought by Europeans from other Africans. You see that in this drawing here. So you can see the European gentleman here inspecting a slave, but you notice what's going on in the background with these guys. These are not slaves. These are Africans who had sold this guy to the Europeans. And you can see some of the items that he's looking to trade for them, alcohol and guns being the two prominent ones. You know, in the 1500s, Europeans were not technologically advanced enough to actually conquer Africa. Spanish and Portuguese slave traders didn't own all of West Africa. They had to make deals with local rulers to trade manufactured goods like guns and alcohol for slaves. Guns were by far the most desired good the Europeans traded for slaves. African rulers used these guns to then conquer more territories, making the people who lived there slaves, and then trading them for more guns. And so it just kept the cycle going on and on. This led to excuse me, the expansion of the slave trade by both Europeans and African rulers in order to make money. You look at the map here. You can see the major slave trading regions here. Now, the majority of them are along the coast in West Africa. These up here in the Mediterranean, they were going in different directions, okay? We're just really looking in here because they were the ones that would have taken across the Atlantic to the Americas. Some of these areas they would press farther inland to, and it really destabilized a lot of this region, you know, because of the greed and aggression that these African states had in trying to gain more slaves. So you saw huge power shifts. Now, once the African slaves arrived in the Americas, they were put to work on plantations. Now, plantations are huge farms that require lots of labor. And conditions on these plantations were typically awful, especially on sugar plantations. You see a picture here of a sugar plantation in Brazil. The death rates of slaves on these plantations were very, very high. So slavery became a driving force of a massive trade network known as, there we go, triangular trade. By the 1500s, slaves were the most valuable commodity from Africa. Spain and Portugal were creating huge plantations in the Americas, and they needed a lot of workers. The original workforce were Native Americans, but like we discussed in the previous video, disease was wiping out their population levels. So Europeans needed a substitute labor force, and they turned to Africa for that. Africans were less susceptible to the diseases that were decimating the Native Americans, and European racist attitudes about white superiority meant that they had no problems bringing them over as slaves. This eventually led to Europeans forming a trade network between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, and you can see by the map, those are your 3 points of the triangle. The Americas will just kind of term as like, you know, so one, we'll just clump that together as one big term, but these are your 3 points here. Okay, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. Now you look at what's going where on the map. So the bulk of this is this leg here, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next one. And these are slaves. Okay, the pink line of coming from Africa, slaves being brought to the Americas. Notice how they're going to the Caribbean first, and from there, slaves would then be distributed to other parts of the colonized Americas. Now, in the Americas, that's where the slave labor would then be used to produce raw materials. Things like sugar, molasses, rice, tobacco, okay, eventually cotton. Cotton wasn't a big money maker at first, but it certainly would be later. Then those raw materials and the money used from selling those raw materials would make their way to Europe. Europe would take that money and invest it into some manufactured goods like guns and clothing and iron. And they would take that and then they would trade those with African rulers for slaves. And then the whole thing would start over again. So it was a cyclical thing. It wasn't just a one way. Well, it was one way, unfortunately, for the millions of Africans sold into bondage, but the whole network just kept on going around and around like this. Okay. Now, one specific part of this trade network I want to talk about in more detail is, you see this here at the Middle Passage. Let's go to a new slide for that so we can start fresh here. So, excuse me, the Middle Passage was the voyage between Africa and the Americas. Look at that map again. This is the Middle Passage. So from West Africa here into the Americas. Let me get rid of the pen. Okay, good. Now, this started back in Africa where Africans were sold into captivity. And reminder, this was often done by other Africans. And then they were put into very tightly packed ships. You look at this diagram and you can see those are bodies laying out on the floor. And you notice how every little square foot is maximized to where you can fit more in, right? You have bodies that are lying perpendicular to the other ones here in the middle. They try to really design it so that they could fit as many human beings as possible. You tried to just cram slaves in there because you didn't really care if the conditions were bad. You know, these conditions were awful. They were atrocious. And obviously there were a lot of issues with disease and starvation. But if you crammed as many as you could in there and you lost some, you still made money. It was more cost effective for the slave merchants to try and pack as many slaves as they possibly could and know that they would potentially lose some to starvation and disease than it was to keep it nice and open and feed them well. You know, that wasn't really cost effective. And remember, it's just about making money. It sounds really messed up because you're talking about humans, but it was just a money-making venture for all these. So, as I said, disease, starvation, it was awful. And if things really got bad, when food and supplies ran low, or if there was a threat of an outbreak of sickness, it was common for the slave merchants to throw Africans overboard. They just couldn't run the risk of running out of food, or they couldn't run the risk of disease breaking out. So it was just more cost effective to get rid of them. You know, it was important that they ensured the survival of the healthy slaves because that was what was going to make them money. And for those slaves who survived the voyage, they are most often brought first to somewhere in the Caribbean. There we go. Where they were sold at slave auctions, where they would be inspected for their teeth and their musculature and make sure that they didn't have lice or any type of, you know, smallpox or a horrible thing like that. And then they were just bought by the highest bidder. And after that, they'd be transported to wherever in the Americas their new owner lived, regardless of if they were separated from family members, parents from children. That didn't matter to them. Again, it was that racist ideology that these are not fully human. And so it allowed Europeans to sleep at night in buying and selling human beings as if they were property. So unfortunately, guys, you know, I know I'm not doing it justice to describe such a horrific and monumental event in human history in just 9 minutes here, but that does kind of sum up the main points to it. So that covers it for the transatlantic slave trade. And in the next and final video for this unit, we will talk about the impact that the Columbian Exchange had.